Okay, so since Entity Identity Framework wasn't installed on initially, we have to install it via the Manage NuGet packages um, application. You can get to it by right-clicking on your application and going to Manage NuGet packages. Next, you have to type in Identity Framework. Enter. What we'll get here is the following. A list of different versions of Identity Framework. What we're going to install is ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core, as well as Microsoft.ASP.NET.Identity. Whoops. Okay, we're missing a library that didn't show up. What we want is Identity for Entity Framework Core and ASP.NET Core Identity UI. So the two classes at the very top of what we searched for. So Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core. We'll install that first. Go I accept. And that's installed. Next we'll install the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.UI. And then accept the license agreement. And it will install. Okay, it is installed. What this did is actually create for us, or install for us, the libraries that we needed to use Identity Framework. Next, we had to right-click on From Scratch app and go to Add New Scaffolded Item. Click on Identity and select Identity Add. So what we just installed was the ability to use the libraries needed to use Identity Framework with Entity Framework. So now, next, select Override All Files. And for our data context, we have to select our data context. So we'll go to the plus sign. Migrations. New scaffolded item, identity, add. On a side note, note how in the CS proj file, which is our project file, it shows the actual packages that have been installed. So if you ever want to actually see what's going on in the background, you'll select that, override all files. We also had to select our layout view, which would be under shared and layout. Click OK. And our data context file should actually be showing up. So I'm surprised it isn't. But location db context. I'm going to double check the namespace which the application that we're using is in. Predominantly because it should be getting picked up from scratch.data. Yeah, I don't know why it's not getting picked up, but usually it would get picked up if we're adding that to our application. So once again, I'm leaving in the errors so that you'll see just how it is when you're dealing with real code. Sometimes things don't go as planned. Context. Add User class, we don't have user class. So add. And this should do the work for us. So now we just wait. And right now it's creating the views. As well as the data. So now we have an interesting error. There was an error running the selected code generator. DB context, application DB context is found but does not inherit from Microsoft ASP.NET Identity Entity Framework Core Identity DB context. So I know what this error is. The reason why it's complaining is because our application DB context inherits from DB context, but Identity Framework wants us to actually inherit from Identity DB context, which is needed for Identity Framework. And within square brackets, we would say Identity User, because we also had to specify what user is being, what class is the user class. So this is Identity User is Identity Framework's default user. So now when we scaffold, it should pick it up. So now that we're inheriting from the right class, it actually picks up our application DB context class. And we'll add it. And all the pages should be generated smoothly for us. The Razor pages, and I mean the views, as well as the migration. So now we just wait. And looky here, it added the code and is telling us what additional steps we have to do. Support for ASP.NET Core Identity was added to your project. The code for adding identity to your project was generated under area/identity. So this is all the files related to Identity Framework, which is great. It did it for us. The generated UI requires support for static files. To add static files to your app, call app.useStatic files from your configure method, which would be in our startup.cs. So let's go and make sure it's there. So we have app.useStatic files in our configure method. Let's see the next one. It says also we need app.useAuthentication in our configure method. Do we have that? No, we do not, so we must add that. So with regards to middleware, which is basically everything we're specifying here, like app.use HTTPS redirection, app.use static files, the order in which these are called matters. What middleware is basically functions that are called whenever you request a web page or make a request to the website. So it automatically runs. So because of that, the order in which the middleware runs, since some middleware might be dependent on other operations that precede it, does matter. That's just something to keep in mind. Next, we have to make sure the generated UI code calls, in order for the views to run, we need to add this to our configure services method in startup.cs. Let's see if it's already there. So we'll go up to configure services, and no, it's not. So let's add it in. And for our endpoints, map controllers and map Razor pages. So we need a views routing, which I believe is already in our code. And we need the app.use endpoints to call the following: map Razor pages and map controllers. So we'll add that above this. I don't think we need map controllers because that's automatic. So now, all that's left to do, since we installed everything that needed to be run, also notice that it says ASP NetCore identity should use HTTPS, which it is using, because that was set by default. So now we have to basically update the database or add a migration, which has the identity tables. So we typed in add migration and it'll generate the code for us. Boom. So these are all the tables the identity framework needs to run. As you can see here, which was automatically generated, as well as the indexes, which is great. Now we'll just update our database. And identity frameworks tables have been created. So now let's take a look at our program. Okay, so here we are. And interestingly, we don't have the login and registration on the very right of our screen. The reason why that happened is because we're missing a segment of code. So whenever we want to add in another page or embed another page in our code in CSHTML or Razor, what we have to do is include something called partial, which is a segment of HTML that you can embed by calling it in any of your pages. So the particular view we want to embed in our code would be in our login partial page, which holds the login information, and we'd want to embed it in the top our menu. So you would type in partial, and I don't remember the code off the top of my head, so let's pull it up. Open with Notepad, and partial's name is login partial. That is it, and it will add in the login and registration for us. In our main page, in our menu. So now we have an interesting error. It says, so the reason why that's occurring is because in our code we have to specify under our services that the identity user is identity user by using services.addDefaultIdentity, as well as the fact that identity framework is using entity framework core. This wasn't included in the instructions from installing identity framework, because initially when identity framework was created, it wasn't specific to being used with entity framework core. It could be used when it was first built. It could be used with just 80.net, and that was its initial function. And 80.net, which is a way of accessing the database on a lower level, is still used today. So identity framework doesn't specifically work with just the entity framework core. This is just one way of making it easier. So it could work with entity framework core, but it's not restricted to just working with entity framework core. Okay, so let's see. And it works. So now let's test in logging in. Let's make a test account. Okay, I created a test password, a registration confirmation. It's confirmed. The login, can we log in? And log in. And boom, we are in. And now all we have to do in order to restrict our current user who has access to the notes controller from calling these functions, only when they're logged in, is to use the following command at the top of our controller, authorize. Then press control period, import microsoft.aspnetcore.authorization, and we have finished creating the entire application that we created previously, basically the same functionality, from scratch. And it just took us about 10 times the time. So now I hope you understand the benefits of using the auto generation features. So if we were to go to notes without having logged in, it's going to ask us to log in. There were some shortcuts I took. Whoops. Entered in the wrong password. Actually, we are logged in, so now we should be able to access the notes page.